Hey, welcome back. It's Nico just suggested a free legs Friday because I have my shorts on today. But this is no laughing matter, what we're about to talk about now. Frank Morano joins me again, and we're talking about Russia, and everybody thinks, the left-wing media will have you believe that there was this big Russia conspiracy, which that's been debunked, and that Trump was an agent, and that's debunked. Everybody thinks he's like the tool of Putin, but actually, Frank, we're in one of the most precarious places we've been with Russia.
I read this book earlier this year called War with Russia, ? From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. And this book makes a pretty persuasive case that our relationship with Russia is in a more perilous place now and a more dangerous place than it's been at any time since the Cold War ended. And it is our great pleasure to welcome the author of that book, one of my heroes when it comes to Russia policy, Professor Stephen Cohen, a professor emeritus of politics and Russian studies at both NYU and Princeton. Professor Cohen, thank you for joining us today.
Frank, you've got to go looking for some better heroes.
Agreed.
Ain't that right?
Agreed. And but Professor Cohen, lest somebody think that you are just another Trump apparatchik, in spite of John's characterization of the left-wing media portraying Trump as a Russian agent, you're not by any means some sort of a right-winger, are you?
Well, I have never been, no. Though, I grew up in Kentucky, where wings left and right really didn't have a connotation. I like to think I'm an issue sort of guy, and particularly when it comes to Russia. So the short story is that when Trump ran for president and he said he wanted to cooperate with Russia, I heard the word détente, an old and venerable word from the 20th century, meaning to try to reduce conflict and increase cooperation with Russia. So though I didn't support Trump as a candidate, I certainly supported his stance on that issue, and I have ever since, despite all the craziness called Russiagate and all the rest.
Professor, it's John Tobacco. Thank you so much for joining us. Your insights are always right on the money. And we call ourselves the purple people because we're in the middle. It's not about the left wing or the right wing. It's about the body politic, and that's most of the people are issue people. Is there anything we can do that can improve this deteriorating situation with Russia?
Well, let me put it a different way. There's not much you and I can do.
No, I mean America. I mean, Donald Trump, our president, watches Liquid Lunch all the time. He tweets about some of our subject matter. In case he's watching, is there something he can do, our policymakers can do?
Yeah, I mean, that's my point, that we're at a moment in history, Russian and American, where a full détente is both necessary and possible. It's necessary partly because militarily we're eye to eyeball with the Russians from Ukraine and the Black Sea to Syria. It's dangerous. And also because the Russians now have a new category of nuclear missiles, they call them hypersonic, that are destabilizing because, well, they're not destabilizing, but they invalidate what we thought gave us the edge, missile defense. So historically, the time is ripe and necessary for a major détente. There's one other thing, and I don't know why President Trump doesn't mention it, but if he's watching or listening, he should, that all the Republican presidents of the 20th century after World War II were pro-détente. The major détentes of the 20th century were those under Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan. Those were Republican presidents. So Trump, when he said, I want to cooperate with Russia to reduce conflict, which is the definition of détente, is squarely in the Republican tradition. He's never made that point, maybe because he doesn't like being beholden to other people's ideas, but it would certainly empower him politically if he made that connection.
Professor Cohen, I want to get your take on this recent explosion in Russia. But before we get there, I'm curious about your take in terms of America withdrawing from this treaty that President Reagan and Premier Gorbachev negotiated back in the 80s. The rationale for America's withdrawal is, oh, well, Russia kept violating it anyway. What's the point in being in this treaty? Was it a mistake for America to withdraw from the treaty? And what do you say to that argument that, look, Russia wasn't following the restrictions of the treaty anyway?
The problem here, Frank, is that we don't have a historical memory or don't think historically. The first major violation of the arms control regime, which made us, if not completely safe, much safer, was the American withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 under President Bush, correct? So that let the demons out of the box, because the United States, once it left that treaty, began to deploy missile defense around Russia. And it's very close to Russia on land, sea, and air. The Russian response, because this is the nature of nuclear arms races, tit for tat, was to begin to build new missiles that could elude missile defense. And they now have this new category that Putin calls hypersonic. By the way, it appears to be one of those experimental missiles that blew up in the north of Russia the other day. But it was the United States' decision to leave, and this wasn't Trump, this was the second President Bush, the best treaty we had, because if you're allowed to deploy so-called missile defense, the Dr. Strangeloves of the United States in Washington began to think, and they said as much, that we could do a nuclear strike against Russia without retaliation because missile defense would protect us. It was folly from the beginning, but once we left the treaty, everybody began to operate on that assumption, both the Americans and the Russians, making new missiles. So that was the original sin and brought us to where we are today.
Professor, some are saying that maybe the explosion was because they were trying to figure out a way to make these, I don't know if it's the hypersonic class or another class, but actually have them fueled by nuclear composites. And then when the missile explodes, then the nuclear stuff explodes also. It's like a double bang. Is that any of your knowledge or reporting?
You know, I don't have that kind of knowledge, but we do have this famous, excuse me, guys, a little allergy. The famous speech that Putin made, I believe, on March 1 last year, where he talked about this new category of weapons and that are borne both by missile and by submarine. And his claim is that they could elude any missile defense that we currently have. Best I can tell, that was not an idle boast. That's true. They had invented them. They had tested them. I'm not sure they've deployed them. But any of these new weapons are accident prone. But the capacity to destroy the United States and our capacity to destroy Russia has been a reality of life, I guess, since both sides acquired the capability, this would have been in the early 50s, to deliver these missiles. So the situation technologically is not new. Mutual assured destruction, as it was called. You strike us, we strike you, we're both wiped out. That hasn't changed. What's changed is the crazy politics, much of it generated by Trump and Russiagate.
And so we're right back to where we began. No treaty, and you attack us, we attack you, and we all keep trying to come up with the best equipment to end the world. Stephen Cohen.
If the United States does leave the INF treaty, and don't forget the START treaty, which is bigger restrictions on bigger weapons, and which expires in 2 years, is not renewed, for the first time in your lifetime and my lifetime, and that's a couple of generations, we will live in a world of nuclear weapons without any restraining agreements.
Wow.
So completely new era.
Goodness to the Lord. Dr. Stephen Cohen, one of the foremost authorities on Russia. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching Liquid Lunch. We'll be back right after this.